Well, welcome to class today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Rosalie Lightning and Tom Hart and his partner, Leela Corman's powerful graphic novel, memoir about Rosalie Lightning, their daughter, 1.5-year-old daughter, who died unexpectedly, and their journey of grief. This fits into today's topic in the sense that we're talking about a very early child loss, a kind of a child that's before the age of a lot of the developmental milestones, but there's also kind of a connection back to Nicholas Wolterstorff, I think, and other examples of child loss from the class. And so I want to start out by talking a little bit about how comics tell. I think it was a choice between this book and another one by Roz Chast called Why Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant, about her parents. She's an only child, and her parents' kind of movement into disability and dementia, and then her being the primary caregiver towards the end of their life. So I recommend that book to you as well. Why Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? But I've been thinking about I've been thinking about how graphic novels tell and why they're such a powerful medium for something like loss and grief. And I was thinking about the woodcuts of, or the Stations of the Cross at Lent, how those visual images and your body's own kind of ability to see them and identify with them leads you on a particular journey. I think in graphic novels, you're closer to the childhood self in some way than just in the prose of academic language or in a theological text. And so graphic novels are more likely on an emotional level to be the medium for telling hidden truths, addressing painful emotions, and figuring disability or hidden shame. I think graphic novels are especially powerful for pastoral care. We saw one with the example of, we've actually seen a couple in class, the comic The Contract with God, which was ostensibly the first graphic novel by Will Eisner. And then we also saw some examples from Hot Comb as well by Ebony Flowers. So comics are essentially a new form of thinking that reaches back to our childhood self, providing us with a profound sense of intimacy. To see one's art is to gesture to the self and its possibility and the distinctive nature of the self as it's named and understood. So I would say that graphic novels or comics really kind of help make sense of the body in ways that written text alone cannot. So graphic novels are kind of ways of dealing with the self in time, stretched between the not yet and the present. They're somehow not serious enough for artists or writers, and so they remain in a liminal space, kind of not unlike the experience of pastoral care itself. So that makes them perfect for pastoral care. They evoke the imagination and guide it differently than the written word, and they leave you in a new territory as a result. You can feel the fatigue or the despair of a character, the loose associations within their narrative. You can feel the secrets that they hold and listen in for a while. So the best comics, the best graphic novels complexify the solutions that a person might have come to in regards to their life, just like the best literature. For comics that do not have a straightforward aim, there can be the aim of telling a story, which is one of the most complex acts. I think graphic novels help us because our inner world is at least partly visual, and graphic novels help us speak across several registers at once, across space and time, across image and language. And they show, just like an icon, kind of an idiom of world, an image world that's aesthetic by its very nature, And by representing these aesthetics in visual form, they come closer to the range of our experience than traditional writing, which kind of traditional writing grabs the imagination in a different way. So for this reason, you have arguably a more intense emotional medium for the experience of grief and for the retelling of it with Rosalie Lightning. So let's talk a little bit about Rosalie Lightning together. So in the book, to begin with, you have kind of the haggard nature of grief, that the faces of the parents make a claim on you, just in the ways that the language of Wolterstorff or someone like that makes a claim on you as well. I also noticed the inscape of Rosalie Lightning's life. So like Wolterstorff talked about his son Eric's inscape, that distinctive set of symbolic associations that were part of his life. The inscape of Rosalie's life really comes out at you with in combination powerfully with Miyazaki movies. If you're familiar with those, we're big fans at our house. And then there's also this kind of visceral connection to poverty and the experience of scarcity in the wake of expecting a child. So that social context of poverty plays a surprising role in the story of grief and loss. You might look at page 32 for an example of that. So Rosalie Lightning is really a powerful, almost devastating story about a young girl, less than 2, who dies suddenly without warning. So from a developmental standpoint, 18 months to 36 months are really that kind of the hatching of the self that's going to be stable across the lifespan. And so Rosalie Lightning is on the cusp of that self, and her parents want to write this memoir in a sense to preserve and recall that childhood self to us, including distinctively her speech patterns, which are then translated into adult speech. You can just feel how creating a work of art like this book might be incredibly powerful. The tree's kind of the central image from the end of the book, but creating the work of art itself is part of the transposition of grief from a register of kind of complete raw emotion to one that's brought into a narrative context, however circular and fragmented, disrupted. So they tell the story of her portents, feeling like there were signs that a day or two before that they should have paid attention to. And then also symbolic things like spilling water on the painting of Rosalie that was on the front of her photo album, seeing vultures the day before. And I noticed these small details that would be significant to a parent, like the detail of a shirt that was torn open and left on the ER room. Having been in a hospital as a chaplain for several years, I know the intensity of that kind of ER scene and how traumatic it is when you're trying to resuscitate someone, especially a young child. So there's a deep underlying level of trauma in the story, and that trauma is kind of brought to life through the images that are carefully chosen and included in the book. So in a sense, there's meta stories here. There's the stories that Rosalie loves, like Louis, like My Neighbor Totoro, and then there's stories for the parents, like Ponyo. Those are 2 Miyazaki movies that they refer to. There's also a kind of conversation with the grief literature, I think, in this book. They're quoting things that they've heard from counselors and from grief experts, and then they're bringing them into conversation with their real life. Avoid the despair in the past and the future. Stay focused. So I was thinking a lot about the background of scarcity and economic suffering, since I know that when kids are in a situation of economic precarity, or their parents are, it also comes across to them. And I was wondering what the 2 stories of home in a new place, Gainesville, and also home in New York, mean as they're trying to remember and memorialize. I wonder if it helped to move from New York, where much of Rosalie's life was, to a new place as they lost. And then there's just pages that are strictly memorial, like page 49, words you loved. I noticed there the pronoun comes out, you. It's the story gets directed to a particular person. Um, so Rosalie, in that sense. So there's moments in which Rosalie's presence breaks through in the book, and it's when she's directly addressed with the you pronoun. Page 49 is one of those examples. So the pages illustrate really well what Wolterstorff was saying in Lament for a Son. There's something distinctive about a connection you make with each individual child. And the book is a representation of that connection. It's bringing to life that particular bond. I love the ways that the parents, if anything, one of the best uses for this book might be for grieving parents who are struggling to bring their stories together. On page 50 and 51, there's examples of them reaching out to one another, grieving with, find each other, and then solidarity. So I think if you look at the grieving journey of the parents and look at how they connected with one another, you could use that as an example for grieving families because of how often the loss of a young child, especially unexpected, can create rifts in the family between the two parents. So the walking meditation from Thich Nhat Hanh is an example of a spiritual practice, but the father can't do it in the meditative way, but only meditates on his daughter's name. Everything in the grief is his daughter, Rosalie. His life is a testimony to her. And her presence really overwhelms this grief story. So the Miyazaki stories that they keep coming back to, those movies, My Neighbor Totoro, Ponyo, those movies are all about illness, caregiving, connecting with nature. So they're full of grief, and they're full of kind of everyday scenes of care in the midst of grief, so they're kind of perfect as a counterpoint. And they're about the healing power of nature. So they're kind of perfect as a counterpoint to the story, and a way of illustrating what Rosalie loved. I'm making this all sound too polished and formal because in grief, all narration breaks down as the book teaches us on page 78. It's about falling into a hole, moving into a secret life, a more capacious hole. So, in a sense, he gets this phrase from a friend. His grief becomes more capacious. It has a capacity in it. It allows a capacity in his life, or in their lives. So for Tom Hart and his wife, both artists, they create and are sustained through images, which they see differently. So the loss kind of, he uses images to help reflect on the loss. You think of them in the sailboat, just he and his partner out on the waters together. That's an image that comes from his drawing for the loss. The book also made me think how loss layers on one another, especially page 94 and 95. One thing I noticed is how grief turns them into searchers. So he's trained to see life in mythic journeys, but they, throughout, they go back. They move into a new house and they immediately begin searching for Rosalie. So this book illustrates more than almost anything else in the class how the bereavement journey, the journey after loss, is one of searching, trying to find in imagination, in fantasy, the reality of the person again, in dreams, in other sorts of inspiration, those in mythic connections. So they talk about going to a psychic. That's a common experience as well. And the psychic encourages them to think that Rosalie might be returning in another life. I was drawn to the fact, and it was almost humbling beyond comprehension, this notion that the mother, I keep forgetting her name because she's not on the cover of this book, Leela Corman, how she would do it again, even if she had to face the same grief, just for the gift of knowing her daughter for the time that they had. Tom says that there's no shortcut to the important messages on page 110. So they go on a journey to heal their grief to a trauma center, a bereavement center, and getting there is an epic journey in itself. And once they get there, they find ways to celebrate Rosalie. They feel grief in the body. The grief counselor, in a very interesting move, tells them to feel the grief, but that the grief is not them. And they externalize the grief through art, creating mountains that are crumbling and other forms of art as well. And the mother really feels vulnerable, Leela, in a way that she hadn't before. And she gets in touch with some of the intergenerational losses related to the World War II period. They do a lot of yoga and go to a sweat lodge. Those experiences connect them to the body, but they also give them a kind of release. A turning over or acceptance that's really crucial to their grief journey at that particular point. And they find that people just start telling them grief stories related to their loss. So when they find out that their parents who've lost a young child, they begin collecting dead babies and dead baby stories. For an example of this, you could look at page 141. And there's an illustration of bargaining in this story as well. They wake up at one point and just want to tell people they've been good and that they're ready to have Rosalie back. Finally, they leave a picture of their daughter behind in the chapel at the grief center, and he also wakes up from dreams several times feeling like he should be fixing his daughter, like there's something he should be doing to rescue her or save her. So there's several grief milestones that appear in the story. One is the touching of the child's hand on page 156. And those are the ones that made me cry, personally. They find themselves talking to people who've lost children a long time ago, and looking for how people who are grieving for 25 years with this kind of loss act. And they talk about how everyone's grief is an island with one or two raggedy survivors, and the difference between grief and grieve, which is huge for them. Grief is a light word, but grieve is an incredibly powerful and heavy one. More than anything else, more than any other text in the class, this book shows how people who are grieving have to relearn a world. And that means a profound disorientation before they're oriented again. They don't know what the world is asking for a long time. They have this friend who has a wound in his chest that came at the same time of Rosalie's death. And that wound becomes a metaphor as it heals for their healing process. They also are drawn to other kinds of inspiration, like Frank King's classic Gasoline Alley graphic novel, where they don't know why they're drawn to these images, but then they find out that Frank King's first child was stillborn, and that's a moment of connection for them as well. He has fantasies of replacing his child with a billion Rosalies, just like her blonde-haired kids. We know from family systems theory how well that would go, but we also know it's really healthy to understand that need for replacement and to work it out even in fantasy before you just actually unconsciously try to do it with your next kid, if you have another one. So grief really reorients their world. Now they see death everywhere, and they look at people in an airport and think about all the grief and loss stories that they're carrying with them. And so they have this new psychic imagination that's painful and that they wish they could block out, but it's a part of their lives now. And it also has a potential, I think, to turn into a gift for us as we read the book. Pastorally, one of the most important sentences is on page 194. I want everyone to mention Rosalie. So I would guess this continues to be the case even after writing the book. I don't know what it was like to take it on the road, or to walk and talk with people about it in cities around the country. But I'm guessing if Tom is like a lot of grievers, they want pastors, to ask about the grief for long after it happens, to kind of have a long-term imagination for that person, rather than being afraid that by raising the person's name you would kind of somehow be re-traumatizing them. Instead, Tom says, I want everyone to mention Rosalie on page 194. So there's some worries in grief, being everyone's worst case scenario. I love that line. Tattoos become a moment of linking to the past. And there's also a sense of having been through it, having lived through the most horrible thing I feared the most and gotten through it. And the story ends with a couple of powerful affirmations of life, both of which brought me to tears. And because they were affirmations that were earned. So often we get into trouble in pastoral care, rushing ahead to the meaning making. But a profound gift of a story so an example of rushing ahead to the meaning making would be something like, you could have another child, or God needed another angel, or something like that. The profound gift of this story of Rosalie Lightning is showing how if there's going to be a moment of transcendence or grace, it's going to really have to be earned through these experiences of pain, through really taking the loss seriously. And I just found my life was made better by encountering this book, and especially encountering Rosalie's spirit, which was that gift of every individual and particular person, which is probably why the coronavirus and the situation of losing so many people at once is so devastating, because everybody who pictures their loved one pictures them in the kind of detail that Tom Hart and his partner and others have shown here, Leela Corman and others have shown through their work together. The grief journey for everybody is just this detailed, in-depth and particular. And so that's the key point from Rosalie Lightning. And if we take that lesson to heart, it could guide our pastoral care in ways that we had never expected. Because really, this kind of telling with art, telling with pictures, with stories, is really a powerful way of bringing to life some of the hardest parts of experience and putting them into pictures. It's a reclamation of hidden truths, painful emotions, a way of thinking that reaches back to our childhood self and cuts through all our rationalization to the very heart of our feeling self. And for that reason, it's an incredibly powerful way of bringing to life some of the most complex parts of our inner world. Thank you for journeying with me in this and for reading this book together this week. Okay, be well.